Sienna, I've been waiting 3 years to say this. Marry me?
Ethan, I can't.
Baby, she's not coming. Tell him. Who was that?
Marcus came back. He never cheated, it was all a misunderstanding. I've always loved him.
3 years, Sienna. 3 years, I gave you everything.
Everything you had wasn't enough. Marcus can give me a life. You never could.
You'll do. Marry me right now.
Excuse me?
Sign here. Congratulations, you're my husband. Sir, do you understand what you just signed?
Wait, who are you?
Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Ethan Cole was 29 years old on the day his life fell apart, and by then he had already spent nearly every one of the last 3 years giving Sienna Marsh things he never got back. He worked late so she could finish school without worrying about rent. He turned down a research position overseas because she asked him, quietly, not to leave her behind. He took a job at her father's company the week after graduation, not because he wanted it, but because it was what a devoted man did for the woman he planned to marry. He told himself, for years, that love sometimes looked like sacrifice, and that sacrifice would eventually be recognized. He believed it the way people believe things they've repeated to themselves too many times to examine closely. What made it easier to believe was the life he'd come from before her. Ethan had grown up in the foster system, moved between 6 different homes by the time he turned 12, and learned early that affection in his life tended to be conditional and temporary. Sienna had been the first person who seemed to choose him without needing a reason. He had built an entire understanding of love around that single fact, and he had never once stopped to ask himself what would happen if the choosing stopped. It never occurred to him that the recognition he was waiting for might never come. When he got down on one knee in their apartment and asked her to marry him, he wasn't gambling on an answer he didn't already believe in. He was closing a chapter he thought had already been written years earlier, back when she first told him she loved him. What he didn't know was that a man named Marcus Heir had resurfaced in her life 2 weeks before, and that Sienna had spent those 2 weeks quietly deciding that Ethan, for all his loyalty, simply wasn't enough anymore. Marcus wasn't a stranger to either of them. He had dated Sienna years before Ethan, had left her without explanation for a job overseas, and had built, in the years since, a reputation for exactly the kind of easy charm that worked on people who mistook confidence for character. When he came back into the city with money that no longer needed explaining and a family name that opened doors on its own, Sienna didn't take long to remember why she had loved him in the first place. She never told Ethan any of this while it was happening. She let him keep planning a wedding for a woman who had already, in every way that mattered, left him behind weeks earlier. The conversation that ended it happened fast, and it was final. Sienna didn't cry. She didn't hesitate the way people do when they still feel the weight of what they're choosing to give up. She told him, plainly, that 3 years of devotion couldn't compete with what Marcus could offer. A family name, money that didn't need to be earned, a life built on comfort instead of effort. She told him he could never give her that life, and she said it in a tone that suggested she had rehearsed the sentence more than once before finally saying it to his face. Ethan didn't argue. He had learned, somewhere in those 3 years, that arguing with Sienna only ever made him feel smaller than he already did, and he had no interest in feeling smaller than he already felt in that moment. He picked up the one bag he'd packed weeks earlier in a moment of naive hope that they'd soon be leaving for a honeymoon together, and he walked out into a city that suddenly had no place for him in it. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have anywhere to go. He had, for the first time since he'd aged out of the foster system at 18, absolutely nothing waiting for him at the end of the day. He wandered for the better part of an hour, past the restaurant where he'd once imagined proposing, past the office building where he'd spent 3 years building a career he no longer had any reason to keep, before he found himself outside a courthouse he had no memory of choosing to walk toward. Sienna's younger brother, Greg, had never made a secret of how little he thought of Ethan. Greg had spent years treating their apartment as an extension of his own social life, showing up unannounced, borrowing money he never repaid, and treating Ethan's patience as an entitlement rather than a kindness. Ethan had put up with it for the same reason he put up with most things in that relationship, because objecting felt like a risk he couldn't afford to take with the one thing in his life that felt stable. He would come to understand, in the weeks that followed, just how little that stability had ever actually belonged to him. Walking those final blocks toward the courthouse that afternoon, Ethan found himself doing the thing he always did when the ground shifted under him without warning, running through every version of the last 3 years that might have led somewhere different. He replayed the nights he'd spent finishing Sienna's coursework so she wouldn't fall behind, the birthdays he'd quietly skipped celebrating so there'd be enough left over for hers, the promotion he'd turned down at a competing firm because moving would have meant asking her to leave a city she loved. None of it had bought him anything that lasted. He was beginning, for the first time in his adult life, to understand that giving everything to someone was never actually a guarantee that they would choose to keep you. It was there, standing numb on a set of cold stone steps, that a stranger's hand closed around his sleeve and changed the entire direction of his life. Her name was Claire Whitmore. She was 28 years old, dressed like money that had never once had to ask permission for anything, and she had exactly 4 minutes left before a legal deadline that required her to be married. She didn't explain why. She didn't ask if he had somewhere better to be. She looked at him the way a person looks at a problem they've already decided how to solve, and she told him, without a flicker of doubt, that he would do. Claire had reasons of her own for what she was doing that afternoon, reasons that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with a company she had spent the last 6 years fighting to keep out of the hands of a board that wanted her married off to secure a merger she had no interest in accepting. A clause in her late father's estate required her to be legally married by a certain date in order to retain full, unshared control of Whitmore Holdings. She had run out of time to arrange anything more sensible. A stranger on a courthouse staircase, as it turned out, was considerably easier to negotiate with than the men on her board who had spent months trying to talk her into marrying one of their preferred candidates. Those board members had made their preference clear for the better part of a year. A merger with a rival logistics firm sealed neatly through a marriage to the rival firm's heir, tidy and profitable and entirely dependent on Claire agreeing to spend the rest of her life bound to a man she had met exactly twice and disliked both times. She had refused every version of that proposal they brought her, and she had watched, with a patience that was wearing thinner by the month, as they quietly began exploring whether her father's estate clause could be used to force her hand regardless. She had no intention of giving them the satisfaction. A stranger she would never have to answer to solved the problem far more cleanly than anyone on that board ever could have. Ethan didn't know any of that yet. He didn't fight what was happening to him either. Some small, exhausted part of him had already decided that nothing that happened to him for the rest of that day could possibly matter less than what had already happened that morning. He signed a marriage certificate to a woman he had known for less than 5 minutes, on the worst day of his adult life, while the courthouse clerk processing the paperwork glanced between them twice. Clearly unconvinced, this was the kind of marriage that belonged in the same stack of documents as the others she'd processed that day. She said nothing beyond the formalities. It wasn't the strangest thing she'd seen at that particular counter, and it wouldn't be the last. By the time the reality of it settled into his chest, Claire was already gone, off to a meeting she refused to be late for, leaving him with nothing but a text message telling him to reach out if he needed anything. He had no idea, walking away from that courthouse, that the woman who had just become his wife ran a company most people in the country had heard of. He had no idea that her last name alone could open doors he'd spent his whole life being quietly shut out of. And he had no idea, this part he wouldn't learn for a long time yet, that the name printed on his own birth certificate had never told the whole truth about where he came from. Claire, for her part, spent the rest of that afternoon in back-to-back meetings without giving the stranger she'd just married a second thought. It wasn't until much later that evening, reviewing the day's paperwork before bed, that she paused on the copy of the marriage certificate long enough to actually read the name printed beside her own. Ethan Cole. She didn't recognize it. She had no reason to. Not yet. Claire didn't do things halfway, and she didn't believe in wasting time on sentiment. Within a week, Ethan had been moved into a penthouse that made his old apartment look like something from another lifetime, driven around in cars that cost more than he'd earned in the last 2 years combined, and left, mostly, to figure out on his own what it meant to be married to a woman he barely knew. She left before he woke most mornings. She came home long after he'd stopped waiting for the sound of the door. Their marriage existed, for those first weeks, almost entirely in short text messages, and the occasional dinner, eaten in a silence too large for two people who hadn't yet decided what they were to each other. Ethan spent those early days the way he'd spent most of his adult life, working and staying out of the way. He returned, without much thought, to the job at Sienna's father's company, mostly because it was familiar, and because walking away from it entirely felt like admitting how completely his old life had collapsed. He hadn't yet noticed how much that company had come to depend on him, the accounts he managed without ever being formally recognized for them, the systems he'd quietly built and maintained without anyone above him fully understanding what they did or how essential they'd become. What Claire never mentioned to anyone, not her board, not her family, and certainly not the husband she'd married in a legal emergency she still hadn't fully explained to him, was that she was beginning to suspect Ethan wasn't quite the ordinary man everyone around her assumed she'd married on a whim. It started small. A comment he made in passing about a piece of technology her own research team had spent months struggling with, offered so casually he clearly didn't think it was remarkable. A late night she came home to find him hunched over a laptop, closing the screen the moment he heard her key in the door, offering no explanation for what he'd been working on. She didn't push, not yet. She had learned, over years of running a company surrounded by people who wanted things from her, that the fastest way to lose useful information was to ask for it directly before you understood what you were asking about. So she watched instead, quietly, the way she watched everything that mattered to her before deciding how to act on it. What neither of them knew yet was that Ethan had spent years building something in the hours no one else was aware of, an artificial intelligence system so far ahead of anything on the commercial market that its existence, if it ever became public, would rearrange the balance of power across an entire industry. He worked under a different name for that project, a call sign from his years competing in international coding championships, back when he still let himself want recognition for what he could do, before the world had taught him that recognition rarely came for people like him. People in that world knew him only as Vantage, a 10-time global champion who had vanished from competition 6 years earlier without explanation and who hadn't made a single public appearance since. He also didn't know that 18 years earlier, in a house far grander than the one he now quietly lived in, a woman named Eleanor Kingsley had lit a birthday candle for a son who had disappeared without a trace at the age of 7, and that she had never once, in all those years, stopped looking for him. There was one evening, a few weeks into their strange, quiet marriage, when the distance between them narrowed for just a moment. Claire had come home earlier than usual, exhausted from a week of board meetings that had gone nowhere, and found Ethan in the kitchen attempting, without much success, to recreate a dish he remembered from one of the few foster homes where someone had actually bothered to teach him to cook. She didn't say much. She sat at the counter and watched him work, and for the length of one meal eaten mostly in comfortable silence, neither of them felt like strangers required to share an address. It didn't change anything about the arrangement between them, but it was the first evening either of them let themselves consider that this marriage, however it had started, might not have to stay as hollow as it currently felt. The Kingsley family had built one of the oldest and most respected industrial and technology holding companies on the East Coast, 3 generations of careful growth, careful reputation, and, though almost none of them realized it yet, nearly 2 decades of quiet theft happening from the inside. Eleanor and Arthur Kingsley had a routine they never spoke about outside their own home. Every year, on the birthday of the son they had lost, Eleanor donated to the same small church, said the same private prayer, and asked the private investigators they still paid to keep searching whether this might, finally, be the year they found him. For 17 years, the answer had always been the same disappointment, dressed up in gentler language. This year was different. A technician reviewing an old case file had flagged something in a photograph, a pendant, custom-made decades earlier, worn by a boy who vanished from a family birthday celebration under circumstances no one outside the immediate family had ever been given a full explanation for. That same technician had recently cross-referenced a background check request that had nothing, on its surface, to do with the missing Kingsley heir at all. A routine check run on a man who had, quite suddenly and quite publicly, married into a business circle that occasionally intersected with the Kingsley's own. The man's name was Ethan Cole. Eleanor didn't wait for more evidence before ordering a DNA test. 18 years of hope deferred had taught her that the cost of being wrong one more time was nothing compared to the cost of not trying at all. Arthur, for his part, had grown quieter over the years, the way people do when grief stops being sharp and simply becomes part of how they carry themselves. He didn't argue against the test. He also didn't let himself hope out loud, not after so many false leads had taught him what hope cost when it turned out to be nothing. The search itself had cost the family more than most people outside it ever knew. Investigators hired and released over the years when leads dried up, a standing reward that had grown, slowly, into the tens of millions, then higher still once Eleanor decided that no amount of money mattered next to the chance of finding her son. She had increased it again just weeks before the pendant surfaced, telling the investigators flatly that whatever number she'd offered before clearly hadn't been enough, and that it would keep climbing until someone came forward with something real. Arthur had stopped questioning the expense years earlier. He understood, better than anyone advising them to move on, that some costs were never meant to be weighed against a budget. What neither of them knew yet, what almost no one in either family knew, was that their son hadn't simply gotten lost as a child. He had been removed, deliberately, by someone inside their own family who had looked at a 7-year-old boy and seen, even then, a rival worth eliminating rather than raising. That person had spent 18 years since watching the Kingsleys grieve, and had never once shown a flicker of the guilt that should have come with knowing exactly where their missing child had ended up. Back in the world Ethan actually inhabited, Sienna wasn't finished with him. Marcus Hale had come back into her life with a family name that made restaurant hosts straighten their posture, and Sienna needed, more than she would ever admit out loud, some kind of proof that leaving Ethan hadn't been a mistake. So she started talking. She told coworkers, and eventually anyone who would listen, that Ethan had used her family's company to build a career he never could have earned honestly, that he had promised her brother a house he never delivered, that he had grown bitter and unstable the moment she moved on with her life. None of it was true. All of it spread anyway, the way convenient stories about an easy villain always do, among people who would rather believe something simple than ask a single uncomfortable question. The people who actually worked alongside Ethan knew better, even if none of them said so where Sienna's family could hear it. They knew he'd carried a disproportionate share of the company's workload for years without complaint. They knew the systems that kept half the department running had his fingerprints all over them, even though his name never appeared on a single official credit line. They said nothing, mostly because saying something meant risking a job that already felt precarious under a management structure that treated loyalty as leverage rather than something worth rewarding. The company itself was quietly beginning to feel the absence of the work Ethan had done without ever being credited for it. Accounts he'd managed for years started slipping through gaps nobody else had noticed existed. A system he'd built to flag client issues before they escalated went unmaintained, and small problems that would once have been caught early started reaching clients directly instead. None of it was catastrophic yet. All of it was the kind of slow erosion that eventually becomes impossible to reverse. The kind that happens when a company spends years treating its most essential employee as replaceable simply because he never demanded to be treated otherwise. Claire heard none of the rumors at first. She had other things occupying her attention, namely, a single line in a background file her assistant had pulled on her new husband, almost as a formality, describing a pendant in an old family photograph that matched, almost exactly, a description her own company's affiliated hospital had once processed a DNA request for. She didn't say anything to Ethan yet. She wanted certainty before she handed a man who had already lost everything once this month a truth large enough to lose himself in all over again. In the meantime, she watched him more closely than he realized. She noticed the late nights spent in front of glowing monitors that had nothing to do with his day job. She noticed how carefully he avoided ever explaining what he actually did in those hours, deflecting with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years learning not to be noticed. She was, without either of them saying so out loud, beginning to suspect that the man she'd married out of legal necessity might be a great deal more complicated than a convenient stranger on a courthouse staircase. She also began, quietly, running her own inquiries alongside her assistants, not out of suspicion of wrongdoing, but out of the same instinct that had made her successful in business long before she inherited a company, the sense that something valuable was sitting in front of her, unclaimed, simply because no one else had bothered to look closely enough to see it. She pulled records from his old university, found a thesis advisor who still spoke about him with a kind of reverence usually reserved for students who leave and never come back, and started to understand, piece by piece, that the man asleep down the hall from her most nights had spent years being underestimated by people who should have known better. There was, in the middle of those chaotic weeks, one confrontation that had nothing to do with company boardrooms or family fortunes, and everything to do with the life Ethan thought he'd already closed the door on. He had put his old house up for sale not long after the courthouse marriage, the same house he and Sienna had once planned to move into together, the down payment on it entirely his own, the mortgage paid faithfully every month while Sienna contributed nothing beyond the occasional opinion on paint colors. He hadn't set foot in it in weeks when he finally returned to meet a buyer's inspector, and he found the front door unlocked, voices coming from inside that had no business being there. Sienna's brother Greg had let himself in, using a key he'd never returned, treating the house exactly the way he'd always treated anything that belonged to Ethan, as something available for his own convenience without needing to ask. Ethan asked him to leave, plainly and without raising his voice, the same restrained tone he'd carried through every other confrontation that month. Greg didn't take it well. He accused Ethan of abandoning his sister the moment something better came along, conveniently forgetting which of them had actually done the leaving, and the argument escalated until Ethan simply repeated himself, once more, with enough finality that Greg finally understood there would be no negotiating a house that no longer had anything to do with either of them. Word of the confrontation reached Sienna before Ethan had even finished the walkthrough with his inspector. She called him that evening, not out of concern for her brother, but out of some instinct that told her the version of Ethan she'd left behind should have folded the moment she raised her voice at him. He didn't fold. He told her, evenly, that the house was no longer any of her business, and ended the call before she could turn it into another performance for an audience that no longer existed. It was a small moment in the larger arc of everything happening around him, but it mattered more than most people watching from the outside would have guessed. It was the first time Ethan had drawn a boundary with the Marsh family, and actually held it. It was a college reunion, held at one of the city's most exclusive hotels, that finally forced everything into the open. Ethan almost didn't go. He had no interest in spending an evening being measured against people who had spent the last several years accumulating the kind of success he'd quietly walked away from more than once. But something, pride or stubbornness, or simply the refusal to let his old classmates believe they'd broken him, convinced him to show up anyway. It went exactly as he expected for the first hour. Old classmates laughed at the idea that he'd once been considered the most promising person in their graduating class. A professor he respected greatly, one of the few people from that period of his life who had ever taken his work seriously, handed him an invitation to the Global AI Summit taking place the following month, and told him plainly that she expected to see his work presented there. It was the first genuine recognition Ethan had received in longer than he could remember, and it lasted exactly as long as it took for the professor to leave the reunion early, uninterested in socializing with people she clearly found beneath her attention. Marcus Hale, who had also come, made a show of offering Ethan a job as his personal driver, loud enough for the whole room to hear, clearly enjoying the reaction it drew from people still eager to be on Marcus's good side. A classmate named Selena, who had known Ethan back when his potential was still obvious to anyone paying attention, tried to defend him and was laughed down by the same group that had spent the evening deciding, collectively, that Ethan Cole's story ended exactly where it looked like it had ended: broke, overlooked, and easy to mock. She had spotted him earlier that evening, arriving in a car well beyond what any of their old classmates could afford, and when she tried to mention it, the table dismissed her outright, certain she was either mistaken or exaggerating for attention. Ethan sat through most of it in the same silence he'd learned to wear like armor over the last several weeks, and told himself it would be over soon. It wasn't over soon. It got a great deal more complicated the moment Claire arrived, unannounced, and the hotel's general manager personally re-rolled out the kind of treatment usually reserved for people whose names appeared on the building's original deed, upgrading their table without being asked, arranging for a bottle from the hotel's private collection to be brought out, addressing Ethan directly as a distinguished guest in front of a room that had spent the last hour deciding he didn't belong in it. The confusion in the room was immediate. Several guests assumed, at first, that the treatment must be intended for someone else at the table, someone with a name they actually recognized. It took the general manager stating plainly, twice, exactly whose husband Ethan was, before the room began to understand what it had gotten wrong. An entire ballroom of people who had spent the better part of an hour laughing at Ethan Cole suddenly found themselves recalculating everything they thought they understood about the man they'd been laughing at, watching in real time as staff who had ignored him all evening scrambled to correct a mistake they hadn't realized they'd been making. Marcus wasn't willing to let the moment pass without one more attempt to reclaim the room. He confronted Ethan the instant Claire stepped away, accused him of staging the entire scene for attention, and the confrontation nearly turned physical before hotel staff intervened. What Marcus hadn't accounted for was Claire returning at the exact moment his composure slipped completely, watching him insist, in front of his own current partner and half the room, that Sienna still belonged to him. It was an ugly, public unraveling, and it left Sienna standing in a ballroom full of people who had just watched the man she'd chosen over Ethan reveal exactly how little he actually valued her. It was only the first domino in a night that had many more still waiting to fall. The DNA results came back 2 days later, and they left no room for doubt. Ethan Cole was Derek Kingsley, the son taken from his family at the age of 7, not lost, as everyone had assumed for 18 years, but deliberately removed by someone inside his own bloodline who had looked at a child and decided, long before that child could ever compete for anything, that he needed to disappear. Eleanor and Arthur didn't waste the reunion on formality. They came to him directly, DNA report in hand, and offered him something no one else in his life ever had: the plain, unconditional fact that they had never once stopped looking for him. Eleanor cried the moment she saw him in person, unable to stop herself, 18 years of grief finally finding somewhere to go. Arthur said less, the way men of his generation often do when a feeling is too large to trust to words, but he held his son's shoulder for longer than a handshake required, and that told Ethan more than any speech could have. It didn't undo 18 years of growing up without them. It didn't erase the particular loneliness of a childhood spent in a system built to house children, not to love them. But for the first time since the courthouse, Ethan had people in his life who wanted him for nothing more complicated than the simple fact that he was theirs. He spent that first week learning small, ordinary details about a family he'd never known he had: his mother's habit of humming while she read, his father's quiet insistence on personally checking every lock in the house each night, the particular way the family home still kept a room, untouched for 18 years, that had once belonged to a 7-year-old boy who never came home. Eleanor showed him that room herself, on the second day, standing in the doorway rather than stepping inside, as though 18 years of preserving it exactly as it had been left had earned it a kind of stillness she didn't want to disturb. Ethan had no memory of the room, no memory of the toys still arranged on the shelf, or the small handprints pressed into a plaster cast near the window. He stood there a long while anyway, trying to feel some flicker of recognition, and finding, instead, only the strange grief of a childhood he couldn't remember losing. Eleanor didn't push him to feel anything he didn't. She simply stood beside him and let the silence be enough for both of them. Not everyone in that family shared the sentiment of welcome. His uncle, Desmond Kingsley, and his cousin, Julian, greeted the news with the kind of smiling congratulations that meant something very different behind closed doors. Julian had spent years positioning himself as heir apparent in Derek's absence, learning the business, cultivating the family patriarch's favor, building a version of his future that depended entirely on Derek never coming back. He watched his cousin's return unfold, with a smile fixed carefully in place and a mind already working through every way it could unravel everything he'd spent years building. Desmond had a far more urgent reason to be alarmed than mere inheritance politics. He had spent nearly 2 decades quietly diverting company funds, including money meant to fund the very search that had finally found his nephew, and he understood, better than anyone else in that house, exactly what would happen to him the moment Derek got close enough to the company's finances to start asking questions. He had built his entire adult life on the assumption that the boy he'd once had removed from that house would never come back to ask what happened to him. Watching him return, grown and clearly not the easy problem he'd once been, was the first genuine fear Desmond had felt in 18 years. They did what people like that have always done when a threat arrives wearing the family name. They smiled in public, offered their congratulations, and began, almost immediately, planning against him in private. The truth about who Ethan really was came out in full, publicly, at the Global AI Summit, in front of the exact room of people who had spent months treating him like a man who'd gotten lucky marrying up. Julian had arrived at the summit that year with one goal: securing a partnership with a reclusive, legendary researcher known only by the call sign Vantage, a 10-time global coding champion who hadn't made a public appearance in 6 years. He had promised his grandfather a 9-figure contract to bring Vantage into Kingsley & Co., certain the achievement would finally cement his position as heir once and for all. He spent the early part of the evening moving through the room with the confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already decided, shaking hands with rival executives and hinting, not quite subtly enough, at a deal he hadn't yet actually closed. Marcus was there too, trying to buy his way into the same partnership for a rival company, mostly to impress people whose approval he'd built his entire identity around chasing. He and Julian crossed paths early in the evening, each sizing the other up as competition for the same prize, neither one aware that the prize they were competing for was about to walk past both of them without either noticing. They weren't the only ones circling. 2 of the country's most recognizable technology executives had flown in specifically hoping to secure Vantage's research rights, each quietly raising their offer the moment they caught wind of a rival's interest, the numbers climbing from tens of millions into the hundreds within the span of a single cocktail hour. Julian, overhearing the scale of what was being offered by companies far larger than his family's own, doubled down on his promise to his grandfather, certain that a multi-billion-dollar contract with a 9-figure salary attached would be impossible for any researcher to turn down. He had no idea, moving through that room with such confidence, that the man he was trying to buy had never once in his life been motivated by the number attached to an offer. When the summit's organizers called Vantage to the stage to accept that year's top research award and Derek Cole Kingsley walked up to receive it, the room didn't simply go quiet. It recalculated everything, all at once. Julian's 9-figure offer meant nothing to a man who had never needed the money to begin with. Marcus's bravado evaporated in front of a crowd that finally understood exactly who he'd spent the evening mocking at the reunion weeks earlier. Whispers moved through the audience fast enough that by the time Derek reached the podium, half the room had already put together who he must be, and the other half were still catching up. Claire, watching from the audience, understood at last the second half of the man she'd married on a whim 4 minutes before a legal deadline. Not just an heir to a fortune he'd never known existed, but one of the most sought-after minds in his entire field. She felt, for the first time since the courthouse, something closer to pride than obligation. Derek didn't gloat. He never needed to. He announced, in front of every camera in the room, that his research would be transferred, free of charge, to Whitmore Holdings, his wife's company, and that he would be joining her there as a partner, not an employee. Julian's carefully built evening collapsed in real time, his contract offer suddenly worth nothing to a man who had just given away, for free, the exact technology Julian had promised his family he would deliver. It was, in its own quiet way, a wedding gift, 18 years and 1 courthouse ceremony in the making, and a public humiliation neither Julian nor Marcus would recover from easily. Back at Kingsley & Co., Desmond and Julian weren't finished. With Derek's return threatening both of their futures, they pushed the family's aging patriarch, Harold, to consider stripping Arthur Kingsley of the chairmanship entirely, pointing to the $100 billion the family had spent over 18 years searching for a son who, in Desmond's telling, had returned disloyal, ungrateful, and already working for a competing company. Harold, worn down by decades of trusting the wrong people and unwilling, even now, to fully see what was in front of him, allowed the conversation to go further than it should have. Derek answered with a wager, almost too bold to take seriously. He would double Kingsley & Co.'s market valuation within a single month. If he succeeded, Desmond, Julian, and Harold would be finished at the company for good. If he failed, his father would step down permanently, and the 3 of them would walk away from the family name without a fight. Eleanor worried it was too much to risk so soon after finally getting her son back. Arthur, quieter than usual, told her only that he trusted their son to know exactly what he was doing, and that after everything Derek had already survived, this was the smallest risk anyone had asked of him yet. It wasn't bravado, it was 6 years of quiet, unpublicized research, finally ready to be deployed into the world. He began by restructuring management, quietly removing the people loyal to Desmond before anyone understood what he was doing or why, replacing them with employees who had spent years being overlooked despite doing exceptional work, people who reminded him, more than he said out loud, of himself. The reshuffling rattled the board more than the wager itself did at first. Longtime executives who had built their positions on loyalty to Desmond rather than performance suddenly found themselves reporting to people half their age and a fraction of their tenure, and the complaints reached Harold within days. Derek didn't explain his reasoning to anyone who demanded it. He understood something his uncle and cousin never had, that a company can't be doubled in a month by people who spend their energy protecting the people above them instead of building something worth investing in. He needed a team that answered only to results, and he built one deliberately, department by department, in the 2 weeks before he had anything to show for it. Then, with 2 weeks left on the clock, he announced the breakthrough system publicly, an artificial intelligence platform nearly a decade ahead of anything currently on the market. Kingsley & Co.'s stock didn't simply rise. It broke records, as 2 of the largest technology investors in the country raced to secure a stake before the opportunity closed. Desmond tried everything he could think of to stop it, shorting the stock, spreading rumors to the press, even attempting, quietly and unsuccessfully, to have Derek's family intimidated into pressuring him to back down. None of it worked. Security around Claire, Derek, and his parents had already been tightened weeks earlier, the moment Claire's people confirmed exactly what Desmond had done to a 7-year-old boy 18 years before. The truth, once it started coming out, came out completely. Years of embezzlement, carefully documented and impossible to explain away. A fabricated story about a curse, paid for and planted decades earlier to justify pushing a rival heir out of the family entirely. Evidence that Desmond himself had orchestrated the original disappearance, using people who had long since scattered but had, eventually, been found and made to talk once the money that had been protecting their silence for years finally ran out. Julian went down alongside him, implicated in funds he had helped move, and in an attempt to intimidate Derek during the final weeks of the wager. Derek didn't send his own grandfather to face consequences out of anger. He did it because Harold had allowed 18 years of quiet cruelty to continue, rather than ask the one question that might have unraveled it all far sooner. And because some debts, once a person is finally in a position to collect them, are worth collecting on behalf of the child, who never got a say in what was done to him. Even in that moment, Derek made clear the difference between accountability and cruelty. Harold would face the consequences of what he had allowed, but he would not be discarded the way he had once, years earlier, allowed a 7-year-old boy to be. The arrests, when they came, happened quietly rather than publicly. Federal agents arriving at the company's headquarters on an ordinary Tuesday morning, escorting Desmond and Julian out through a lobby full of employees who had spent years watching both men treat the company as something owed to them rather than something earned. Harold's fall was smaller in scale but no less final. He was removed from every board he'd sat on, stripped of the title that had defined him for most of his adult life, left to spend his remaining years understanding, far too late, what his silence had actually cost. Sienna and Marcus's reckoning was smaller, though no less complete in its own way. With the truth of the reunion humiliation now public, and with the man they'd both once dismissed no longer available to either manipulate or resent, they were left with exactly what they had built together, each other, and a story about a man they'd thrown away that nobody particularly wanted to hear anymore. Sienna's father's company, weakened for years by decisions made in Ethan's absence, struggled to recover its footing without the very person it had never once properly credited for holding it together. Derek resigned the chairmanship not out of guilt, but out of choice, handing daily control back to his father, who had waited 18 years simply to have his son in the same room, let alone running the company that bore their name. He kept the Vantage name for his own research. He kept his place at Whitmore Holdings, working beside his wife as an equal rather than beneath her as an employee, the two of them building something together neither could have built alone. And when Claire told him, a few months later, that she was pregnant with twins, the man who had begun this story kneeling on the floor of an apartment that no longer wanted him ended it surrounded by more family than he had ever let himself hope for. The Kingsleys got their son back. Claire got a partner who had never once needed her money to prove what he was worth, and the people who had spent a lifetime underestimating both of them were left, in the end, to carry the particular weight that always comes due for anyone who mistakes someone's silence for weakness. In the quiet months that followed, once the lawsuits had settled and the company's stock had steadied at its new, doubled valuation, Derek found himself doing something he'd never once let himself imagine as a child moving between homes that were never really his, sitting at a long table, surrounded by people who shared his blood and had no intention of ever letting him disappear again, watching his mother laugh at something his father said, feeling, for the first time in his life, like the word family described something solid, rather than something he'd have to keep proving he deserved. He kept Vantage separate from all of it, in the end, a name that belonged to the parts of himself no family fortune had ever touched, the parts he'd built entirely on his own, in rooms no one else knew about. He didn't need it to prove anything anymore. He kept it because it was still, in the quietest way, the truest thing anyone had ever called him. If you'd have forgiven him, or if you think Claire should have told him the truth sooner, let us know in the comments below.